Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for February 24th, 2021. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different today because we have to step back from the present chaos and confusion and come up with a perspective for how we can actually create the changes that are necessary. We're in a situation where the United States is totally polarized, as are most of the countries in Europe. There's a strategic crisis which has a real war danger connected to it, an economic crisis where there are people warning of Weimar-style hyperinflation, domino-style collapse of various financial instruments. The banking system is shaky, propped up only by central bank intervention. We have a global pandemic, which in many ways is getting worse. And then on top of that, we have a solution proposed by the so-called establishment, the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, which will worsen the situation on all counts, with the Great Reset moving to establish a global central bankers dictatorship, which will determine what money can be spent on what projects, which would basically mean bailouts and no investment in the real economy. And at the same time, connected to that is the Green New Deal, which would eliminate real physical production and put the world back on a course toward the Middle Ages in terms of energy flux density and ability to produce goods, a radical depopulation proposal. Now, what we see is that the leaders of political parties are all over the place on this. And what do we have? Well, take a look at what happened in Texas. On the one hand, you have conservatives who are correctly identifying the problem with so-called renewables as one of the central features of the collapse of the electricity grid in Texas. And while the liberals and the Democrats are defending that, and some Bush Republicans are defending the windmill policy and solar policy, most of the Republicans oppose that if they're not off on a vacation like Ted Cruz. On the other hand, the Republicans all support deregulation. And there is a major role played by deregulation to set the Texas system up to collapse by non-investment in improvements and upgrades and winterization in order to increase the profit, which is what neoliberalism is all about. So when you have a neoconservative, neoliberal general consensus dominating the two parties, what do? Well, I think this is where we should turn to former Mexican President Jose Lopez Portillo, who said that it's time for the world to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche. And on September 9th, 2012, on the occasion of his 90th birthday, Lyndon LaRouche gave a talk where he attacked the idea of the party system, the corruption of the party system in the United States. He pointed out that you need to remove Obama, that Obama at that time was president and Obama was pushing us on a course toward war. But he pointed out that Romney was no better. He said, the problem is the party system. Neither candidate is fit to be president. From the beginning, the party system was a travesty. Now, I'm going to read some of that speech because I think it's important for people to think this through when you're looking at the current situation from the standpoint of despair. We just had 4 years where we had a candidate who, in a sense, was from outside the parties, and yet his administration was undermined by the partisan nature of the country, including the role the Republicans played to sabotage his initiatives with Russia and also his opposition to free trade. So let's listen to what LaRouche said. He said, from the beginning of our nation, from the beginning of the development of our presidency, our system of government, a very bad mistake crept in. It was called the party system. And the party system was a travesty which has corrupted and in part destroyed the United States by itself, by means of itself, over much of our nation's history, as in other nations as well. But the idea of the party system, he said, is a form of degeneration which must be eliminated if we're going to be able to cope with the real challenges which mankind should be occupied with now. We do not need a party system. And he says, what happens with a party system? At the time, 2012, he said, you got two jerks running for president now, official jerks, one Republican jerk, the other a Democratic jerk. The Obama-Romney election was a prescription for disaster. Now, what happens is people look at the division of the two parties and say, well, there's no choice. Do I submit to policies I don't like from the Republicans because I support them on this or that? Should I support the Democrats even though I disagree with them on this or that? But what you have to realize is both parties are dominated by ideology, which is not aimed at developing the nation, but at private interests. On the one side, you have neoconservatives and neoliberals in both parties. I shouldn't say on the one side, that controls both parties. The neoconservatives, the ones who believe that we need endless wars. And while there are a few people in both parties who oppose that, as President Trump did, but his initiatives to end the wars by working with Russia and China were undermined by democratic opposition and by people in his own administration, especially people like Pompeo, the Secretary of State, excuse me, who pursued a war policy his whole time as Secretary of State. So you had the neocons and then the neoliberals. The president tried to move the United States away from free trade policies toward a tariff policy. But this was undermined by the strategic relationship with China, which some in his administration saw as more important to have a confrontation with China than collaboration with China. And it threw him off course with that. And so you had also the president wanted to invest in infrastructure. And what happened to that? It was undermined by Schumer and Pelosi on the one side and by McConnell, Paul Ryan, and free trade, free market Republicans on the other. So looking at this situation with neocons and neoliberals, both of which are part of the establishment from the City of London and Wall Street, which controls politics in the United States and controls the media, what do? Well, how can we attack this problem, he asks, within the law of our system as it stands today? I would suggest there is a remedy. The problem is the party system. He said, President George Washington and others at the founding of our republic, as an independent republic, tried to prevent the formation of a party system. I think the time has come to eliminate the party system. It's the only way formally through the legal process that we can eliminate the possibility of these two kinds of presidents, referring to Obama and Romney. What's wrong? Why should we have party systems? We have a constitution which is defined. The Constitution is fine if it's carried through as intended. It is our system. But why do we have to have parties intervening between the process of selecting presidential leadership and national government? Why do we do that? What screwball invented this kind of nonsense? Because that's what happened. People become partisan and say whichever party wins is going to determine the fate of the nation. No party, LaRouche said, has that kind of right. There cannot be a party that has the right to oversee and control the destiny of the nation. You can have a president. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can't have a president as the president of a party. Or you cannot have a conniving between two presidential teams by special agreement among themselves to create the composition of a national government. These things are obscenities, which leaders of our nation, beginning from the George Washington administration, recognized as evils. And he says, what's the solution? We'll go back to our Constitution. He says, we're not going to go to a European kind of government because that's inherently corrupt. The only way this can be done is if we infect the population with the realization we do not want a party system. We have state governments, don't we? Under our Constitution, we have local governments within state governments under our Constitution. We have bodies which the nation creates to perform functions of the federal government, the military and the rest of it. So we don't need parties. They don't do any damn good. He said, this is a system of inherent corruption. What we need is the due process election of a composition of government. And we don't want people diverting the attention of the population from the issues of the nation over the issues of partisanship. That's where the problem lies. And he concluded this section of the speech by saying, we want to confront the citizen with his or her responsibility for being accountable for what government is and what it becomes. We have to force responsibility upon the individual citizen as a citizen, not as a sucker playing into some kind of game. Now, what does that mean today? Look at this situation. We just put out a report exposing the Great Reset and the Green New Deal as the policy of the international banking and globalist elite to destroy the idea of national sovereignty and to impose a top-down global governance controlled by the central banks operating on behalf of the private banks. This goes directly against our national interest. The national interest of the United States is that government promotes the general welfare, not the interests of private groupings. But under the idea of the so-called free market, the private groupings with the most money and the most power determine the policy. And then through the media, they manipulate the population to choose between two or three options, neither of which are any good. For example, the Green New Deal. This is a travesty. It's anti-scientific. We just saw what happened with it in Texas. But at the same time, Texas was also infected with the idea of deregulation and privatization, which meant that in order to increase the profit of the private corporations, necessary improvements and repairs and winterization was not done. Why? Because it cost money and it cut into the profit. So if you have a system that operates on behalf of private profit over and above the needs of the nation, that's where the problem is. Now, which party represents the interests of the nation? At this point, neither party. You have people like Senator Cotton from Arkansas, who's putting forward a strategy now for essentially economic warfare against China. I may talk about that more tomorrow. You have people in the Biden administration who, in general, have in the past supported that same policy. The Democrats and Republicans both voted in the Senate and House against President Trump's efforts to end the endless wars. What's the national interest? To have more of these endless wars or to end them? So it's from this standpoint that I'd urge you to take a look at what Lyndon LaRouche said about ending the party system. And I'll have in the description of this YouTube statement where you can find LaRouche's speech on ending the party system. Read it, think about it, talk about it with your friends. We don't need more partisanship, we don't need more polarization. We need a commitment to a national mission based on the principles embedded in our Constitution. Doesn't mean we know the solution to everything, but it means we have a process of discussion that starts from the standpoint of what is the true national interest, as opposed to what is the interest of this group and that group and this group and that group, and the one that has the most power, whether it's numbers or money, determines the policy. That doesn't function, as we can see. So let's put an end to the party system, or as LaRouche said, the potty system, and get back to something that coheres with the concept of a national mission to promote and defend the general welfare as our Constitution demands. Thank you. I'll join you again tomorrow.